Welcome to this presentation on selecting a methodology. When you engage in acts of empiricism, you need to be considering the kinds of empiricism and the approaches to empiricism you want to engage. That's about using your senses. They could be about observing the world and identifying phenomena for study. They may engage descriptions of these phenomena, increasing breadth and depth. You may move on to identifying relationships and differences within and between these phenomena, moving then to building models, developing theories and testing them or breaking them, and then improving them, so that you can eventually move to the ability to refine the models and theories so that they can properly explain the underlying structure and function of the phenomena under consideration, and they can predict how these phenomena will behave. In doing so, we need to consider the differences between methods and methodologies. A methodology is the overall research design that shapes the methods to be used. The methodology provides a rationale for the choice of methods used in a study, whereas methods are the techniques used for data collection. And an example of that would be an experimental study to consider whether a new intervention is able to improve learning outcomes. That would be, for instance, a pre-post or randomized controlled trial. That would be a methodology. And then the instrumentation used, the methods used, would be, for instance, pre-post instruments, as in tests of knowledge or capability. They may involve interviews or some other kind of technique as well. All of those would be methods. In thinking about a methodology, we need to be able to think about being able to answer the research or study questions that we've posed. So if we come up with a problem or a set of questions, then our methodology should respond to them. And it should be grounded in theory, which provides its ontological and epistemological paradigms, the way that it can speak to what exists and how do we know. Which means we can also ask practical questions, such as what kinds of data do you need? How will you analyze them? What is practical, allowable, parsimonious, i.e. simple? And what methodologies have others used to answer or approach similar kinds of questions or studies? And do you have the skills and resources that will allow you to conduct the methodology? So in terms of what kinds of data do you need? Well, if it's about opinions, then we need to have data that reflects the opinions of different individuals. Thinking about analysis, then we need to, for instance, conduct a thematic analysis on transcripts of interviews to get to understand what it is that people are thinking. In terms of what's practical and allowable and parsimonious, well, we can't ask questions that would be unethical. We wouldn't be able to conduct tens of thousands of interviews unless we had very generous resources to work with. In terms of what methodologies are they used, well, we can, for instance, use grounded theory or phenomenological approaches as to guide the way we conduct the studies, because those are established methodologies to address these kinds of issues. And we can think about whether we actually have the skills either in ourselves or in our research team, and what skills we need to bring in or resources we need to provide to allow us to do our methodology. And each should be adjusted to fit to the other. There are many different dimensions of a methodology in terms of the overall strategy for a study. We've already in a previous presentation talked about problems and hypotheses and questions. The methodology needs to have the conceptual grounding for why we're approaching the study in this particular way. It'll indicate the kinds of data collection methods and the analysis methods that we'll use, although we'll talk about those in a later presentation, as well as the way that those are going to be synthesized and reported. And we can again think about modes of inquiry as approaches to a methodology. Each of these essentially is a methodological stance: meta-scholarship, evaluation, translation, research, innovation, conceptual and synthesis, although they all have different kind of approaches and methodologies within them. And here's a series of examples. So for instance, in terms of evaluation, for instance, we might look at an audit of a particular activity or a program evaluation. In terms of research, we might look at an efficacy study, which is under controlled conditions, does an intervention work or work better? In terms of a conceptual analysis, we might look at a critical analysis, say a discourse analysis of the way that material is being presented. And a synthesis methodology might be, for instance, a systematic review. there are different methodological implications for the methodology that you select in terms of what exists and what kind of thing it is, what can we know about it and how can we know about it, and indeed the axiological dimensions, the beliefs and values that that puts across. And as an example, if we were to conduct a study into improvements in student competence as a result of an educational intervention, then we would posit that competence exists and it's something that we could measure. And indeed, we would then probably engage with some kind of measurement tool that looks at their performance in terms of improvements, quantifiable improvements in performance, that allow us to say, well, we can know this through the measurement of performance, which is to do with axiological values around the performance is something that can be measured, and this research has value to be conducted in this way. When you look at methodologies, it's very difficult to avoid getting involved in some discussion of quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative research are inquiries to do with how much, it's to do with quantities. Qualitative research is to do with how well, qualities. But it's also generally considered to be broader, to look at any kind of descriptive research that doesn't involve quantities. We can also look at multiple studies which use different methods in parallel. So, for instance, a study that may have two experimental approaches, two quantitative approaches, or maybe a quantitative and a qualitative approach, but they're in parallel. So they describe different parts of a problem, which is different from doing mixed study research, which is to do is to undertake studies where the methods actually relate to each other. So, for instance, we might do a quantitative study to say how much do individuals experience something, and then follow up with a qualitative component is to say, and what is their experience like? To what extent is their experience good or bad? And that would be a mixed study. And indeed, there are many, many different kinds of paradigms and stances within choosing a methodology. And for instance, and this is an example purely from within the qualitative dimension, but there are similar approaches to be found in quantitative as well. Creswell describes in his book, Qualitative Inquiry and Research Design, Choosing Amongst Five Approaches, he says, well, there are five principal qualitative methodologies you need to select from. Grounded theory, which is to do with creating theory empirically from the data. Ethnography, which is to do with participation and engagement within a community or group of practice, to experience the flow and the nature of a group working together. We may engage with phenomenology, which is to look at the experience. What is it like for an individual or different individuals to be engaged in something? We may engage in some kind of case study inquiry, which is to say, what specifically happened in this environment at this time? So a case study is bound in place and time, and is generally considered to be idiographic in the sense that it may or may not be generalizable. There's also narrative research, which is to do with telling stories, to understand a phenomena by telling stories about it, lived experiences, life experiences, and so on. These are different methodologies within the qualitative paradigm. There are many others within qualitative, there are many others in quantitative, and many others still which don't necessarily fall easily but into one or either, such as realist methodologies. In thinking about a methodology, you need to consider to what extent you want to adopt a paradigm, an existing established methodology, or be more pragmatic in borrowing from two or more different paradigms or methodologies. There is a strength from moving to an established methodology in the sense that you can then build on the work that others have done in this, but it's also a weakness that you are then somewhat constrained within that methodological stance. On the other hand, you can pragmatically borrow or adapt methodological stances from multiple sources, and there are strengths in this, in that you can be more pragmatic and eclectic in saying, well, I don't need to commit fully to, say, grounded theory on a philosophical level, but I can use principles such as constant comparative method, which is about seeing whether you have reached saturation in your analysis, or memoing, which is about building provisional micro-theories as you go through an analysis. But there are also weaknesses in the sense that you need to make sure that your methodology that borrows from multiples is conceptually and theoretically coherent, that it makes sense, that you're not asking or drawing things that have no relationship one to another. And in the next presentation we'll talk about methods, but in thinking about the move from methodologies to methods, there should be alignment, and there should be a logical top-down and bottom-up coherence, in the sense that your methodologies should indicate the kinds of methods you use, and the methods that you select should be relevant and meaningful in the context of the methodology you use. For instance, if you have a methodology which is exploring the experience of learners undergoing a particular kind of training context, then you might, which is a methodological stance that may, for instance, draw on phenomenology, which is to do with the experience of individuals, then we might engage in interviews, we might observe them. But it's very unlikely we're going to engage in any kind of measurement, because that would not necessarily reflect well on a phenomenological stance, which is to do with experience. Experience cannot necessarily be easily quantified, at least not in a coherent way. So in summary, your methodology is your overall inquiry strategy, within which you can select your methods, and your methodology should suggest, give coherence and meaning to the kinds of methods you select. There are many methodological positions you can take, each of which has strengths, weaknesses and implications, and it is worth pausing at the methodological stage to consider whether you have the appropriate methodology to address your problems and research questions before moving to methods.